In Jordan B. Peterson's 12 Rules for Life, An Antidote to Chaos, Rule 1 instructed the reader to stand up straight with their shoulders back. And this advice isn't bad on the surface level. When you dig into the details, it does get a bit murky. Melting lobster brains, anyone? Do we start Beyond Order 12 More Rules for Life in a similarly clear and straightforward manner? Well, you tell me. Rule 1, Peterson wants us to not carelessly denigrate social institutions or creative achievement. Not quite as strong a start, methinks. Maybe he'll save it with some really good life advice? No. This video made possible thanks to the continuing support of viewers, patrons, and PayPal pals like you. Thanks! Hi, welcome back to this cognitive psychologist's take on Beyond Order. Before we get into the content proper, there's a couple things I need to touch on from the overture video. First is addiction, and so if you need to skip this part, go to the time somewhere on screen or use the YouTube video segment marker. It'll take you to the next thing. It was pointed out to me, both by people with lived experience as well as practitioners in treating addiction, that wanting to cut a substance out of your life, no matter the cost, can be a feature of addiction. And the important thing here is that this can delay people seeking or getting help in treating the addiction because it's not something that we typically associate with being an addict. So, Peterson may or may not have been psychologically addicted to the anti-anxiety medication he was on. The truth of that situation is for him to know and share as he sees fit. I was wrong in saying that he was acting like an anti-addict. That statement is not helpful in the greater addiction discussion and may be delaying people from getting help or misdirecting them. So, I'm sorry. Second is another correction, this time due to a reading comprehension fail on my part. In the previous video, I had said that ibogaine is related to one of the ingredients used in the preparation of ayahuasca. Yes, they are on two different continents. One is in South America, one is in Africa. And I did some pretty impressive mental gymnastics to make that make sense, with like continental drift and common ancestors and speciation and all that stuff. So in rereading the source, the correct understanding to take from what's written is that the psychoactive ingredient in the South American vine, harmaline, is chemically related to the psychoactive ingredient in ibogaine. So they're chemically related even if the plants aren't. Sorry for the confusion. The final thing is a note or comment that was originally in the overture script that I decided, I don't need this. This isn't going to come up again. I don't need to waste people's time talking about this, but apparently I do. So, when I read the Peterson quotes, I am trying to give a representation of what I think the intent is behind what he's saying. And I know it's not impersonation. I know. I do have some self-awareness in that regard. There are plenty of YouTubers or podcasters or other people who have a really good spot-on Peterson impersonation. Mine is not that, I know. And I'm not intending to mock or demean or caricature or infantilize or any of the other things it's been described as or I've been accused of doing in doing these quotes. The point behind doing the distinct voice from what I talk as is to make it readily distinguishable for people who aren't watching these, because a fair number of people put them on in the background or just listen to it on headphones, to make it easy to know when things are being directly said by Peterson and when I'm paraphrasing him or responding to him or otherwise giving Peterson through my filter instead of Peterson himself. That's the point of doing it. That's the only point, and it is what it is. Okay, with all that out of the way, the last thing to do is to review the visual shorthand I use in these to represent where ideas or arguments are coming from. This means I'm paraphrasing the book. This means I'm responding to the book or integrating my thoughts with science. There's no book references in the chunk we're talking about in this video, so it's just stuff I'm bringing to the party. Alrighty. Let's talk about a couple observations I have now that I've actually read the whole book, and then we'll get to that first rule. To get the overture video out quickly, I read as much as was necessary to do so, meaning I'd only read the overture at that point. But thanks to an invitation by the Goat and the Goblin to chat about this book on their Twitch livestream, I had an excuse to find some time and sit down and power through the whole 400-500 pages of this book. The biggest impression my first quick read through left me with is this book feels more like a DLC to an existing video game than its own standalone work. So, let's say Citadel for Mass Effect 3, as opposed to Assassin's Creed 2 Brotherhood. And sure, Peterson himself said that Beyond Order is meant to be the companion to 12 Rules, but that's not quite the vibe I get from it. Maybe you'll disagree as we go through the series, but to me, it seems like Beyond Order integrates and elaborates on some ideas from the first book, but in a way that seems more like rehashing and not a complementary yet standalone piece of work. I would have thought a sequel in this context, acting as a yang to the first book's yin, would have played with the chaotic side of the first book's rules and emphasis on the ordered life. The first 12 rules were meant to be an antidote to chaos after all, so to me, the mirror and companion of that would be to spend some time in the chaos he wanted to keep at bay. But here's the rub of that. Despite having the occasional trappings of order and chaos, most of the advice in the book wasn't really one half of a balanced equation. For example, Rule 10, be precise in your speech, which was amusingly imprecise in and of itself, included sections on how computers work, sort of. Elaboration on Peterson's view of how perception works, with the discussion going to an absurd degree at times. But that pivots to perception only working when things aren't chaotic, using a car breaking down as an example, with that metaphor also being taken to an interesting place as well. The ordered perception falling apart gets stretched to include a hypothetical woman who was cheated on by her spouse, with another adventure into grand implications of the event, and the doom baked into chaotic life events, and a lengthy discussion of the hypothetical causes of this fictional woman's marital strife. Part of the intended lesson here is to confront the chaos and turn it into order, lest your relationships meet a similar end. This is said many different ways, but the repeated idea is that chaos is unmanageable and needs to be properly ordered for us to function. I really can't do justice the grandiose framing on this in this quick summary, but bottom line, order good, chaos bad. And the way to have order is to be precise in your speech. That rule set up chaos as a terrible, destructive force always lingering in the background, just waiting to strike and ruin your life. With that setup, how could Peterson write a matched pair exploring what happens when you're too precise in your speech? Well, okay, it would actually be doable potentially if he talked about censorship or propaganda or something that's very much in his Twitter wheelhouse, but that wouldn't really be actionable advice in the same way, and presumably that's what these books are offering. My point is that the distilled gist of the advice in that chapter, that being able to clearly communicate your needs and boundaries to others is an important life skill, doesn't need the extra framing of order and chaos. It's able to stand on its own. The extra framing may be style madness popping up again, the possible side effect of too much Jung, but that extra framing isn't adding anything useful to the advice. If anything, it seems to be getting in the way of a bit of precise life advice. But it wasn't just Rule 10 that set up chaos as something to be fended off at all costs. This was a recurring theme throughout the book, how to live an ordered life so that the chaos doesn't destroy you. So to set up the sequel as now venturing into that chaos because, oh yeah, by the way, too much order is also bad, doesn't quite logically hang together. I know that the overture in both books try to establish that the balance between order and chaos is what's important, but come on. In reality, the first book we were in Order City with the chaos forest surrounding us, threatening us with doom and destruction and nihilism and raisin cookies of awfulness. And in this book, after the balance is mentioned, it's clarified that we need to tentatively stretch into chaos from an ordered position. Related to that idea, though, I do have a conceptual defense of how one would go beyond order into chaos, so perk up your antenna, little lobsters. I'm defending Peterson here. Although I am going to have to dip into some style madness myself to do it, so let's hope it's not an Event Horizon sort of situation. Okay, instead of thinking of order and chaos as two diametrically opposed forces existing on the opposite ends of a continuum, let's say order and chaos exist on a sphere. Yeah, I know it's a cat. Assume a spherical cat. And one half is order, the other half is chaos, and let's even say the boundaries between the two are in a state of flux. So, in the first book, the reader is sort of positioned on the order side of things, and the advice acts as a way to get the reader comfortably back into order when chaos introduces itself. But, as occasionally given lip service in 12 Rules, too much order is a path of tyranny, which is bad. And so the solution to that is to introduce some chaos into your life. And you would do that by going beyond order into chaos. So the book title makes sense to me. And while we're talking about the title, it was pointed out in my Discord that this may be an allusion to Nietzsche's Beyond Good and Evil, which I was told by my philosophy friends was a move lacking in self-awareness, given the content of Nietzsche's work. I'm not really sure where to include this info, but may as well be here, I guess. There is a stylistic distinction between the two books in how the rules are numbered. 12 Rules for Life used regular alphanumeric numbering, and Beyond Order uses Roman numerals. Perhaps if this is turned into a trilogy, we will next see tally marks. One final comment is that the art at the start of chapters plays a much larger role in the content this time around. Peterson goes much heavier into the symbology of stuff in this book, so in that regard it does make sense. It seems like the artist commissioned with producing these either got done dirty by the book print or didn't quite plan for how the images would look when in book print format. There is a stark contrast when compared against the first book's art. It's clean and made the transition between its original format to the book's printing pretty much intact. Even when incorporating or translating famous works, like The Death of Socrates or David. That is not the case this time around. The Beyond Order artist's website has some work with a good level of detail and clarity, but that clarity and detail is super not apparent in the book, even in the versions she has posted on her own website. I think they were trying to invoke a woodcard feel with these, which would have worked really well when translated to print, but that's not what the final product looks like. Granted, it does come closer on some chapters than others, but it still looks more like digital art that's had a filter thrown on top of it than a piece deliberately drawn from a woodblock technique. I will leave it to your discretion if this ends up being an apt metaphor for this book. Let's play a game. How well do you know the Petersoning? Do we start off this chapter and the book itself with A. A lengthy discussion of a fictional sport and how it relates to alchemy. B. A story about a former client with enough details changed to protect their anonymity. C. A story about an animal that becomes the overarching theme of the chapter. Or D. Direct life advice that's fleshed out with further stories or research. If you chose D, you apparently have not had adequate exposure to these books yet. Whether or not getting this wrong is an actual loss is up to you. Choice C is how 12 Rules for Life started, so not a bad guess to think he'd do it again in this book, but no. A is how we'll spend a good chunk of chapter 2, so also not a bad guess. Nope, correct answer is B. A perennial favorite way for Peterson to convey life advice. To be a little fair, Peterson likely interacted with many clients in his time as a clinical psychologist, and they may have been helped by his treatment, so sharing what worked does make some sense. However, sharing their stories did get Peterson some criticism last time around, especially when one client came forward saying they were still pretty identifiable in what he shared about them. Alrighty. The book. A former client of Peterson's is described as having a very rough life, with things like being socially isolated from his surviving family, his wife having died some point before this guy started seeing Peterson, and a subsequent romantic relationship ending abruptly when his partner was killed in a car accident. And Peterson describes him as socially awkward, which he ascribes to possibly having an abusive childhood, and relentless teasing, both as a child and as an adult. Peterson puts the causality of this man's communication style on all of this, seemingly ignoring that his abrupt, irritable, and somewhat volatile nature could have existed before these things. Peterson says that the appointments with this client went best if he didn't say anything until the very end of the session, and that these appointments were happening every other week for roughly a decade. As noted in my videos on Freud and Jung, these types of therapy aren't typically planned out to be a quick process. It's usually expected that you'll be seeing this person for years. And over the years, this client gradually focused less on the negatives in his life. Peterson credits this to this client going out and working on his social life, which then let him generate solutions to the problems he was facing. This is explicitly linked back to the original's Rule 9, assume that the person you're speaking to might know something you don't, with the whole needing to outsource thinking to others idea, including the necessity of proofing plans or ideas off of others. I will not rehash all of my arguments against these lines of thought here. Suffice it to say that I disagree with this idea that you need to outsource your thinking to others because you're not sophisticated enough to do it by yourself. Sometimes it's useful to bounce your ideas or plans off of other people to get a separate perspective from your own. That doesn't mean that you're not capable of independent thought. The first part of Peterson's explanation for this client's more positive shift over time isn't bad, emphasizing that he needed to be part of a social group. Across many different contexts, we've seen the importance in a person having a social support network for a good quality of life. We are a social species, after all. But mini doom spiral had this client not worked on his social life.
Had he fallen prey to the temptation to denigrate the value of interpersonal interactions and relationships because of his history of isolation and harsh treatment, he would have had very little chance of regaining his health and well-being. Instead, he learned the ropes and joined the world.
Minor doom spiral sign. Certainly not the worst we've seen from Peterson in this regard. Although the denigration of value is an interesting choice of words. Peterson wasted no time in unleashing the depth psychologist at us this time around.
For Drs. Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung, the great depth psychologists, sanity was a characteristic of the individual mind. People were well adjusted, in their views, when the subpersonalities existing within each of them were properly integrated and balanced in expression.
He then quickly lists off the main components of the Freudian and Jungian personality structures. First, a reminder about the citations needed flag. It popping up doesn't necessarily mean I'm disagreeing with Peterson. It just indicates that, from what's written and how it's phrased, some sort of reference or citation should be there. Proper source handling is an important part of scientific writing, even when moving into the lay sphere as with these books. At the very least, if a reader is curious about the depth approaches or concepts that were brought up, where does Peterson, the expert, think they should start? Where were these things discussed? It's probably useful to reiterate periodically that something being a pop science or self-help book doesn't reduce the demand for proper citation. And Peterson's branding is as a clinical psychologist. In these books, he is acting as an expert and an authority. And there is some responsibility that goes with that, including proper attribution for where different arguments or ideas are coming from. Although, as you'll see as we move through this book, Peterson expresses more things as his feelings or his opinions rather than concrete fact. And in these instances where it's clear that he's speaking his thoughts on something rather than representing the scientific consensus, citations aren't needed. Second, I won't go into detail on the proposed personality structures here. I'll include links in the description for my videos on Freud and Jung and why they're scientifically problematic. It is interesting to contrast the openings of the two books. At this point in 12 Rules, we were talking about lobster and bird hierarchies. At least this is playing more to Peterson's training. Finally, while I'm not going into detail on these personality structures, neither's Peterson. It's almost like he's assuming that the reader has some basic knowledge of this stuff and is just being reminded of it, or that the level of detail included was sufficient. But the thing is, this level of detail is not enough, especially with Jung's tantalizing name for things like the shadow or the anima. And the cherry on top of all of this, with where Peterson's going next, all of this depth psychology stuff could have been cut.
But all these different sub-entities, Jungian and Freudian alike, share one thing in common. They exist in the interior of the person, regardless of his or her surroundings. People are social beings, however, par excellence, and there is no shortage of wisdom and guidance outside of us, embedded in the social world. Why rely on our own limited resources to remember the road or to orient ourselves in new territory when we can rely on signs and guideposts placed there so effortfully by others? Freud and Jung, with their intense focus on the autonomous individual psyche, place too little focus on the role of the community in the maintenance of personal mental health.
Peterson and I would almost certainly disagree about the empirical validity of the depth approaches, especially as originally written by Freud and Jung. So just know that the rest of the psychological community is not entirely convinced that these are solid explanations for how we work. But like I said earlier, with how quick Peterson's moving on from Freud and Jung, it really could have been cut. It also didn't take long for Peterson to dip into the human exclusivity this time either. I guess we're not going into animal models this time, seeing as how, example, ants also leave a form of navigational marker for others to use. When Peterson takes on a new client, he has some social dimensions he assesses them on, although how exactly he assesses them is not described. Their educational level, according to their intellectual ability or ambition. How they use their free time, specifically if it's engaging, meaningful, and productive. What are their future plans? Do they have health problems? What's their financial situation? What's their social life like? Are they close to their family? What's their job situation? Is it stable and fulfilling? If the client is lacking in at least 3 of these dimensions, Peterson considers them socially isolated and at risk of spiraling downwards psychologically. It is unclear to me if these are based on something published somewhere, or if these criteria just seem to be important in his time as a clinician over the years. It's also not clear how he assesses these, and perhaps more importantly, how he quantifies them. Taking the education one. It would probably be pretty easy to ask the person if they're happy with the amount of education they've attained. But how does Peterson assess ability? You could probably get a rough estimate from asking how their previous educational endeavors went, but even that's going to be potentially skewed by things like problems at home, financial hardship, or other factors that could lead to underachievement. A concern I have here is Peterson deciding what level of education somebody should get based on his assessment of them. People can be creative and intelligent with or without higher ed. We know from the first book that Peterson could be a bit judgy if he didn't like the client's plans or job choice. Peterson said he actively listened to his clients, but from how he spoke of a former client in the original's Rule 9, the listening chapter, it's hard to think that some of his internal thoughts didn't impact his treatment of his clients in some way. Speaking of that internal monologue,
people exist among other people, and not as purely individual minds. An individual does not have to be that well put together if he or she can remain at least minimally acceptable in behavior to others. Simply put, we outsource the problem of sanity. People remain mentally healthy not merely because of the integrity of their own minds, but because they are constantly being reminded how to think, act, and speak by those around them.
Before getting into specifics, I want to share some writing choices I noticed in this book. The first book seemed to use he more than other pronouns, especially for the reader stand-in. This book is getting a fair bit of mileage out of he or she, and cool, thanks for being more inclusive, but you could have saved yourself some typing in places and added a little variety by using they. I'm sure it doesn't need to be remarked why Peterson probably didn't use they. A more subtle change is Peterson isn't really using the Canadian spelling for things for the most part. And don't get me wrong, I am grateful for this. When I'm typing out the quotes, I don't have to add extra U's in places or flip the ER on some words. So thanks for that, but I am curious what motivated this change. This claim that we outsource our sanity is something from the first book. Rule 9 to be specific. The listening chapter again. What exactly Peterson means by sanity is not clear. It initially sounds more like the clinical-ish meaning of the word, but with what's coming next, it seems more like the general usage. It seems Peterson has not changed his tendency in playing fast and loose with words and their meanings in this book. This claim wasn't supported in 12 Rules by anything other than Peterson saying it the first time, and that hasn't changed here. And I'm not saying that we don't need some level of social contact with others, or more extreme, being put into solitary confinement isn't going to have a negative impact on your mental well-being. However, that is different than outsourcing sanity to others as claimed by Peterson. It seems like to him, the emphasis is on social policing, keeping you acting as you should, rather than on the mental stimulation by way of social activity with other people. But if Peterson's claim were true, a prediction would be that people low in sanity would just need to go out and socialize more. And on some level, this may kind of be the case. Like, pulling yourself out of a depressive slump to go socialize with people can help, but it's not the entire picture, especially for severe psychological disorders. Just thinking about my experiences with my own psych disorder menagerie, more socialization is not the answer when I'm trending towards mania. I want to do all the things with all the people all the time, just So the answer is not more socialization. If anything, it's kind of pulling back from that, finding some chill, low, activities to try to get the trend back into more normal territory and not just woo. We also have a little bit of the negative framing from the first book popping up again. You just need to be put together enough to be tolerated by others. Don't do it for yourself, do it because others have to deal with you. It's amazing how shifting the locus of control from internal to external can make the advice less pleasant. But it continues on, now with a smidge of ableism for seasoning. The gist is if you start acting improperly, responses from others will cajole, laugh, tap, and criticize you back into place. So when you're around other people, they will keep you acting at your best. You just need to pay attention to the cues they're giving off. And that's all fine and dandy if you can easily understand the social cues from others, but not everyone can. And this is another recurring issue from the first book. One-size-fits-all advice that ends up not fitting too well. The example that comes to mind, possibly because it's also related to autism, comes from the parenting chapter. What the parent needs to do if a neurotypical child is having a meltdown is different than if an autistic child's having one. But this difference isn't discussed or even mentioned in that book's discussion of how to parent your child in such a way that makes you not hate or resent them. In the previous book, there were implicit and explicit arguments that involved the LGBTQ community, with the largest chunk going to trans and non-binary people. Given Peterson's rise to prominence being linked to his opposition to Canadian Bill C-16, which added gender identity and expression to the discrimination prohibitions, it was in keeping with his brand. In my first pass through Beyond Order, I didn't notice as many of those dog whistles as I had in 12 Rules. But while watching Jesse Gender's recent video on trans visibility, this idea of social policing to keep people sane kind of maybe took on a different meaning. Jessie talked about her experience in having to hide her true self because of that social policing that Peterson's talking about here. So, with Peterson's previous arguments about trans and non-binary people being misguided, and his recent inclusion and platforming of Abigail Schreier on his podcast, Peterson may be in the camp arguing that trans and non-binary identities are not valid, possibly even wanting to go back to gender identity and expression itself being the disorder, as opposed to the current view that gender dysphoria is the only disordered part. And I know this may be a reach, but in this context, it seems possible that some of the subtext to the sanity by way of social response could also be referring to people deviating from the compulsive heterosexuality norms. Moving on. Peterson says that the various social policing methods used by others will keep you properly motivated to keep on being social appropriately, and thereby avoid the psychological downward spiral. Maybe that's how it works for him, but with my anxiety, not so much. I can be very worried at how I'm being perceived by others. In more intense periods or situations, it can get exhausting. I'm trying to not do anything to make myself look dumb. I'm trying to do things to make sure at the very least nobody hates me, hopefully actually like me. And I'm doing everything in my power to not catch that sort of social policing action that Peterson's talking about. If I was laughed into place over something, I would be devastated. If the situation permitted, I would likely just completely withdraw from whatever that was and be mortified about it for years to come. So basically, the social policing can lead me into a negative psychological spiral. And the same is probably also true for people experiencing bullying. Although I imagine the case could be made that the bullies are just social policing to a tyrannical degree. Continuing the idea that our mental well-being is housed in others, in part because they enforce social norms, Peterson asks some rhetorical questions.
But how did we develop the broad consensus regarding social behavior that serves to buttress our psychological stability? It seems like a daunting task, if not impossible, in the face of the complexity that constantly confronts us. Do we pursue this or that? How does the worth of this piece of work compare to the worth of that? Who is more competent, or more creative, or more assertive, and should therefore be ceded authority?
These questions would be more interesting if he didn't seem to immediately answer them in the following sentences. Seeming, because it's a half answer that doesn't indicate that it's basically setting up the next couple of sections. And if you have some memory of 12 rules, you know where this is going. Develop a consensus? Tradition. What to pursue? Meaning. Comparing worth? Also determined by meaning. Authority determination. Dominance hierarchy. But why is creativity in there? Peterson talked about competence and assertiveness in the first book, but not creativity. Oh, dear viewer, I have such sights to show you. Eventually.
Answers to such questions are largely formulated in consequence of intensive negotiation, verbal and nonverbal, regulating individual action, cooperation, and competition. What we deem to be valuable and worthy of attention becomes part of the social contract, part of the rewards and punishments meted out respectively for compliance and non-compliance, part of what continually indicates and reminds. Here is what is valued. Look at that. Perceive that, and not something else. Pursue that. Act towards that end, and not some other.
See what I mean about this being a half answer? There is some meaning baked into what's said here, but you have to be familiar with Peterson's previous work. Fuck. This is exactly what the little lobsters would leave in my comments on those videos. So it's a good time to bring up my counter argument to that idea. 12 Rules for Life was sold as a standalone work. There was no indication that you needed to watch his lecture series, his interviews, his entire back catalog in order to access the meaning of this work. It should be understandable on its own, which leaves this book in a strange spot. It's the companion to 12 Rules for Life. Does that mean you need to read 12 Rules first in order to understand Beyond Order? Or is Beyond Order able to stand on its own? Is this book an add-on to the first, or its own thing? How should a sequel to a self-help book function? And how should a video series covering these books deal with this? Peterson told Weinstein that
they complement each other, so if you read both of them are better, but I designed each of them to stand on their own.
So apparently, it's both. It is a standalone product that's better together with the first book. This is going to be a recurring thing for this book. Some topic or concept that has some deeper meaning buried in the first book. Possibly discussed by Peterson, but possibly not. At the very least, I will point these out when I notice it happening, and possibly rehash the arguments, especially if Peterson isn't, or if there is a good opportunity for an educational adventure. Anyways, divorced from that prior context, I would likely be having a lot of why and how questions with these answers. A lot of this is coming from Rule 7, pursue what is meaningful, not what is expedient, as well as Rule 4, compare yourself to who you were yesterday, not to who someone else is today. Expect to see discussions of those in the coming videos.
Compliance with those indications or reminders is, in large measure, sanity itself, and is something required from every one of us right from the early stages of our lives. Without the intermediation of the social world, it would be impossible for us to organize our minds, and we would simply be overwhelmed by the world.
As always, there is the question of what this has to do with the rule's title. Do not carelessly denigrate social institutions or creative achievement. Although, lucky us, this at least somewhat relates to social institutions. Sort of. But, you know Peterson, he likes that slow build until he throws the rule's meaning at you in a font of style madness towards the end of the chapter. Linking sanity to compliance with social norms is somewhat in keeping with our discussion of the 3 Ds of psychological disorders: distressful, dysfunctional, and deviant. In this case, Peterson's hitting the socially deviant D and bouncing on it all day long. I'll stop. One of the broad criteria when considering if a behavior is disordered or not is if it violates social norms. Like compulsively buying old Soviet art to cover the walls and ceiling of your residence could be seen as not quite normal behavior, if not a fire hazard. So, keeping with Peterson's social policing idea, me commenting on this could be seen as an act of social policing trying to get that behavior back into something more normal. I think there is a bit of a distinction to be made between taking a hit to your mental health from a lack of social interaction and psychological disorders. To explain what I mean here, I'm going to use his claim that was incorporated into the Rise of Jordan Peterson documentary, that a person who is hoarding needs to start by cleaning out the hoard, and that will somehow result in a cleaner mind. As I mentioned in my review of that documentary, this is treating the symptom, not the cause. If you don't get at the reason why they're hoarding, they'll likely go back to it after cleaning up. So there is an association between things like depression and withdrawing from social activities, and people in a depressed state may be encouraged to go out and do social things. But this is not the same thing as saying that socialization determines people's mental health status. Correlation is not causation. The following sections get into Peterson's aim and perception stuff that we encountered in 12 Rules, so this is a good breaking point. Until next time, bye!